You need to leave. This cabin belongs to me." That was the first thing she ever said to me, not hello, not welcome, just a claim on property I'd legally purchased 6 hours earlier. I stood there with the deed in my hand, the keys in my pocket, and a woman I'd never met telling me I was trespassing on my own land. Her name was Diane Prescott. She'd been HOA president for 18 years, and she had no idea that the documents she'd forged to steal this cabin were about to destroy everything she'd built. Before the next part begins, let me know where you're watching from. Drop a comment below if you want to follow stories like this. Hit subscribe. But let me take you back to the beginning. 3 years ago, I lost my wife Elena to cancer. We'd been married for 15 years, and when she died, the world stopped making sense. I threw myself into work. I'm a furniture restorer and carpenter by trade, but the house we'd shared in Asheville had become unbearable. So when I found a listing for a century-old cabin in Ashe County, tucked into the Blue Ridge Mountains near Pinewood Ridge, something clicked. The photos showed decades of neglect, roof sagging, windows broken, porch collapsing, but beneath the damage I recognized solid oak framing from the 1920s, hand-cut joinery that modern builders couldn't replicate. This was a project I could lose myself in. The purchase went through an estate sale. The previous owners, the Hendersons, had held the property since 1924. Both had passed away years ago with no children, and the estate had languished in probate until a distant relative finally authorized the sale. I paid cash everything Elena and I had saved, plus the life insurance. The title company confirmed the deed was clean. By noon on that Thursday in late September, I was standing in front of my new home, breathing mountain air that smelled like pine and wet earth. For the first time in 3 years, I felt something other than grief. Then, the white SUV pulled up, and Diane Prescott stepped out. She was in her early 60s, with blonde hair styled stiff, wearing a blazer too formal for a mountain road. She didn't introduce herself or ask who I was. She simply walked toward me, stopped at the edge of my property line, and delivered that sentence like a verdict. I held up the deed and explained I'd just bought this property legally. She dismissed it without looking. "Anyone can get a piece of paper," she said. This land had been HOA property for 20 years, under their covenant. Abandoned structures revert to community ownership. Whatever I thought I'd bought was a scam. When I asked for documentation, the specific bylaw. Anything in writing, she told me she didn't need to show me anything because I was the one trespassing. What struck me wasn't her claim I knew my deed was legitimate, but how much she knew about the cabin. She mentioned the Hendersons by name. She knew Walter Henderson had built the structure in 1924, that Martha Henderson had died in 79, that the cabin had been unoccupied since 2003. This wasn't a neighbor curious about a newcomer. This was someone who had studied this property, researched its history, and waited for the right moment. I asked how she knew all that. Her expression flickered before the mask returned. She said she knows everything that happens in Pinewood Ridge, suggested I leave by tomorrow morning, and drove away without another word. An hour later, I met Walter Grimes, 78 years old, who had been in Pinewood Ridge since 1972. He'd seen my car and walked over, the first friendly face I'd encountered. When I mentioned Diane's visit, his expression darkened. He muttered that she was starting again. He told me Diane had been collecting land around here for years, and some of it wasn't hers to take. The Chavez family lost property in '07. Olivia Chavez's grandmother had a stroke during the dispute and never recovered. The Nguyen's in 12, Old Man Sanders in 18, forced out 3 months after his wife's funeral. All of them had paperwork issues. None could afford to fight. Walter looked at the cabin and told me to check my documents, all of them, and not to trust anything that woman says. That evening, I explored the cabin's interior. Water damage in the back room, animal nests in the rafters, decades of grime coating every surface, but in a closet near the kitchen, I found something unexpected, a tin box tucked behind fallen shelving. Inside were letters, tax receipts from the 1940s, and a sealed envelope marked in faded handwriting, Original Deed Henderson Family, 1924. I didn't open it yet, but I set it aside. Before leaving, I mounted a trail camera on a tree facing the cabin's entrance, a habit from my workshop days. If anyone came onto this property, I'd know. At 9:47 that night, my phone buzzed with an email from Diane. Final warning, vacate by noon tomorrow or face legal action. I looked out at the dark mountains. No, this is my home, and I'm not going anywhere. The noon deadline came and went. I didn't leave. By 12:01. An email arrived from Richard Prescott's law firm, a formal cease and desist letter. Richard Prescott was Diane's husband, a retired real estate attorney. The letter demanded I immediately vacate HOA property and cease all unauthorized construction activities. I hadn't built anything yet. I'd barely swept the floors. But the language was designed to intimidate, filled with legal terms meant to make an ordinary person panic and retreat. I saved the email, printed the attachment, and started a folder. If they wanted a paper war. I'd been preparing for battles like this my entire career. Every piece of furniture I restore begins with documentation. This would be no different. The violation notices began arriving the next day, each on official HOA letterhead signed by Diane Prescott. The first cited me for unpermitted construction. I'd done nothing but clean debris. The second claimed my vehicle violated community standards. My truck sat in my own driveway. The third alleged failure to maintain property appearance. The cabin I was actively restoring apparently didn't meet their aesthetics. Each notice carried a $200 fine. I photographed everyone, took time-stamped pictures proving my truck was entirely on my property, and created a spreadsheet logging every interaction. The pattern was clear. They were building a paper trail to justify future action against me. Then Diane went after my reputation. She sent an email blast to the entire community claiming I was an illegal occupant who had fraudulently obtained documents to steal HOA land. She urged residents to report any suspicious activity directly to her. Within 48 hours, I'd gone from new neighbor to community pariah. A man I'd never met shouted from his car that squatters weren't welcome. A woman walking her dog crossed to the other side of the road when she saw me. Someone called the sheriff's office to report a trespasser. The deputy who arrived examined my deed, confirmed I had the legal right to be there, and left. But the damage to my standing was done. 1 week after my arrival, I drove to Asheville for restoration supplies, specialty hardware, wood treatment, replacement glass. I was gone for 6 hours. When I returned, the cabin's front door had been pried open. My materials, nearly $800 worth, had been dragged into the yard and scattered. Cans of wood stain were punctured and leaking into the dirt. Someone had spray-painted a word across the cabin's exterior wall in red letters 3 feet tall. Trespasser. I stood there in fading light, hands shaking, looking at the violation of everything I'd come here to build. Then I remembered the trail camera. The footage showed 2 men arriving in a gray pickup at 2:14 in the afternoon. They spent 23 minutes destroying my property before leaving. One made a phone call. Wind noise obscured most of it, but I caught fragments. Done, and what sounded like Prescott. Not proof, but enough to confirm my suspicions. I called the sheriff's office. The responding deputy watched the footage, filed a report for vandalism and criminal trespassing, but said identifying the men would be difficult without clear faces or plates. Then he told me something that stayed with me. This isn't the first complaint about the Prescotts. But proving anything is hard because people around here are scared of them. He suggested I visit the Register of Deeds office in Jefferson if I wanted to understand what I was really dealing with. The next morning, I drove to the Ashe County Register of Deeds. The clerk who helped me was named Teresa James Professional, thorough, clearly competent at navigating decades of property records. I requested the complete chain of title for my parcel. Teresa pulled the documents within an hour. My deed was legitimate, traceable back to the Henderson family's original purchase in 1924. But there was something else: a quitclaim deed filed in 2005, transferring ownership from James Henderson to Pinewood Ridge Homeowners Association. Teresa frowned as she examined it. She explained that quitclaim deeds don't require title searches, so anyone can file one claiming anything. And this signature, she said, pulling up other Henderson documents from the 1940s for comparison, doesn't match any Henderson family signatures on file. I asked if she was saying it was forged. She chose her words carefully. "It's worth investigating," she said. And the notary listed was Victoria Watson, who used to work for a law firm in Boone. I drove back to the cabin with a copy of that quitclaim deed and growing certainty that Diane's claim wasn't just aggressive, it was criminal. Walter was waiting on my porch. He'd seen the spray paint and come to check on me. I showed him what I'd found. He nodded slowly, unsurprised. He told me Victoria Watson's name had appeared on other disputed properties, though each case was different. The Chavez family fought for 2 years before medical bills from Olivia's grandmother forced them to settle. The Nguyen's hired a lawyer who mysteriously withdrew after 6 months, nobody knows why. Johnny Sanders tried to go to the county commissioner, but the commissioner was a golf buddy of Richard Prescott. Same notary, same outcome, different ways of breaking people down. I asked if anyone had ever won. Walter shook his head. "Not yet," he said. I looked at the quitclaim deed, then at the tin box on my table. "If this signature is fake," I said, "there might be more, and if there's more, I'm going to find it." That night, I finally opened the sealed envelope from the tin box. Inside was the original deed from 1924, handwritten on heavy paper that had yellowed with age but remained perfectly legible. Walter Henderson and Martha Henderson had purchased the land from Blue Ridge Land Company for $375. The deed described exact boundaries using natural landmarks: the creek to the north, the ridge to the east, and the old logging road to the south. It also contained an unusual clause: "This property shall remain in the Henderson family in perpetuity unless sold by direct descendants or their legally appointed representatives." Language like that was common in rural deeds from that era, a way of keeping family land intact across generations. Whether it would hold up in a modern courtroom was uncertain. But one thing was clear: there was no mention of any homeowners association. The HOA wouldn't exist for another 61 years. The quitclaim deed from 2005 listed James Henderson as the grantor, supposedly a direct descendant exercising his right to transfer the property. I needed to know if James Henderson was real and whether he'd actually signed anything. The next morning, I drove to the Ashe County Library and spent 4 hours in their genealogy section. Census records confirmed James Henderson existed. He was Martha Henderson's nephew, born in 1931 in Wilkes County. Obituary archives told me the rest. James Henderson had died on March 15th, 2002, in a nursing home in Winston-Salem. He was survived by no children. The quitclaim deed transferring my cabin to the HOA was dated November 3rd, 2005, 3 years and 7 months after James Henderson stopped breathing. A dead man had signed a legal document. That wasn't a clerical error. That was forgery. I brought everything to Teresa James at the Register of Deeds. She examined the death certificate, compared it to the quitclaim deed date, and her professional composure cracked just slightly. She told me that filing a forged deed is a Class H felony in North Carolina, punishable by up to 25 months in prison. She also confirmed what I'd suspected: Victoria Watson, the notary who certified James Henderson's impossible signature, had worked as a paralegal for Richard Prescott's firm from 1998 to 2012. The connection between the Prescotts and the fraudulent document was no longer circumstantial. It was a direct line. I needed professional help to build a case that would hold up in court. Through a referral from my insurance agent, I found Evelyn Shaw, a forensic document examiner and real estate litigation attorney based in Asheville. Her retainer wasn't cheap. But I'd rather spend money fighting than lose everything by doing nothing. Evelyn requested records for the 3 properties Walter had mentioned. What she found was damning. The Chavez property, taken in 2007, had a quitclaim deed signed by Maria Chavez, who had died of heart failure in 2004. The Nguyen property, taken in 2012, had a quitclaim deed with a signature that didn't match any Nguyen family member in county records. The Sanders property, taken in 2018, was notarized by Victoria Watson using the same format as my fraudulent deed. 3 families, 3 different years, 1 identical playbook. Evelyn laid it out for me in her office. "This is systematic," she said. "The Prescotts have been filing fraudulent quitclaim deeds for at least 15 years, targeting properties they considered abandoned or disputed. The HOA acquires the land on paper, then either holds it or sells it." She was still digging into the financial records where the money actually went, but the pattern of theft was already undeniable. They weren't just claiming land that wasn't theirs. They were building an empire on forged signatures and dead people's names. I contacted Olivia Chavez first. She was hesitant. Her family had spent 2 years fighting before her grandmother's medical bills forced them to walk away. But when I explained what I'd found, that her grandmother's supposed signature had been forged years after the woman's death, her hesitation turned to cold fury. She agreed to join a coordinated complaint. Johnny Sanders was easier. He'd always believed something was wrong, but never had the resources to prove it. When I showed him Victoria Watson's name on his paperwork, he said he'd testify anywhere, anytime. Walter Grimes, after 18 years of watching in silence, finally agreed to provide a written statement documenting everything he'd witnessed. Evelyn prepared a comprehensive legal package criminal referral to the Ashe County District Attorney for forgery, fraud, and theft by deception, a complaint to the North Carolina Real Estate Commission against Richard Prescott's license, and a civil quiet title action to establish my ownership. We could file everything quietly and let the system work, she told me. But there was another option. The annual HOA meeting was scheduled for the following Saturday. Over 150 residents would attend. If I presented the evidence publicly, Diane would have to respond in front of everyone she'd spent 18 years controlling. "People like her can't resist defending themselves," Evelyn said. "And when they do, they usually say too much." I looked at the stack of documents: original deeds, death certificates, forged signatures, witness statements. Diane Prescott had been stealing from this community for nearly 2 decades. It was time they knew the truth. I picked up the phone to call Olivia. "Let's finish this together." The annual HOA meeting was held at the Pinewood Ridge Community Center on the first Saturday of November. I arrived early and counted heads as residents filed in by 7 o'clock. Over 160 people had taken seats in the folding chairs arranged across the linoleum floor. More than any meeting in the past decade, Walter told me. Word had spread that something was happening with the cabin situation, and curiosity had overcome the usual apathy. I'd also made a call to Jenny Marsh, a reporter from the Ashe County Times who covered local government. She sat in the back row with a notebook open. Diane Prescott took her seat at the board table, flanked by Richard and 3 other members. She looked confident, even pleased by the turnout. She had no idea what was coming. Diane opened the meeting with routine business, then pivoted to what she called a matter of community concern. She explained that an individual had been illegally occupying HOA property for the past 6 weeks, ignoring cease and desist orders and refusing to vacate. The board had voted unanimously to pursue legal eviction. A few people nodded, most just watched, waiting when she finished. I stood and requested the floor. Diane's eyes narrowed, but Richard leaned over and whispered something they had to follow their own bylaws in front of this many witnesses. She smiled thinly and told me I had 5 minutes. I walked to the front carrying a laptop and a box of documents. I connected to the projector and turned to face the crowd. I told them I wasn't a squatter. I was a homeowner. And tonight I was going to show them exactly what their HOA president had been doing. The first image was the original Henderson deed from 1924, handwritten. Clear, describing the exact parcel I'd purchased through a legitimate estate sale. The title was clean. The chain of ownership was unbroken for 81 years. There was no HOA claim to my property because my property predated the HOA by 6 decades. The crowd shifted slightly, a few exchanged glances, but most remained still, uncertain where this was going. Then I showed them the quitclaim deed from 2005, the document Diane claimed gave the HOA ownership. I pointed to the signature line, James Henderson. Then I showed them James Henderson's death certificate, died March 15th, 2002. The room went completely silent for a long moment. "A dead man signed this document," I said. "That's not a mistake. That's a felony." Someone in the third row whispered something to their neighbor. The whisper spread outward like ripples. I watched Diane's face tighten, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. I continued with the pattern. "The Chavez property, taken in 2007 with a forged signature from a woman who died in 2004. The Sanders property in 2018, notarized by Victoria Watson." Olivia Chavez stood up in the middle of the room. She said they took her grandmother's land with a signature her grandmother couldn't have written because she'd been dead for 3 years. Her voice cracked, and the whispers in the crowd became murmurs. Johnny Sanders rose next with the same story. Victoria Watson's name was on his paperwork, too. The murmurs grew louder, angrier. People were leaning forward now, faces hardening. Then I showed them the financial records. Since 2008, the HOA had sold 3 parcels acquired through these quitclaims. Total proceeds over $1.2 million. The money went into the reserve fund, controlled exclusively by Diane and Richard. I displayed the expenditures, conference trips to coastal resorts billed as board meetings. Administrative fees paid directly to Diane totaling $68,000, and legal consulting fees paid to Richard's firm for work never itemized. The murmurs exploded into shouts. People were on their feet, pointing at the board table, demanding answers. One man yelled that he'd been fined $300 for a fence violation while Diane vacationed on his property. Diane stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. She called it defamation and lies, said I was twisting documents to cover my own fraud. Her voice rose as she insisted she had saved this community, that without her leadership, Pinewood Ridge would be nothing. Those families didn't care about their land. She shouted. They abandoned it. I made something of it. Richard grabbed her arm, hissing at her to stop, but she pulled away. I protected this community for 18 years, she screamed. Everything I did was for Pinewood Ridge. The shouting stopped. 160 people stared at her in the silence that follows a confession no one expected to hear. Walter Grimes stood slowly. He said he'd watched this woman bully families out of their land for 18 years. And tonight, it ends. Someone called for a vote to remove the entire board. Seconded, thirded. The motion passed by an overwhelming majority. As the vote concluded, the doors at the back opened. 2 deputies from the Ashe County Sheriff's Office walked in. Evelyn had coordinated with the district attorney earlier that week, and they'd been waiting in the parking lot for my signal once the community had spoken. They approached the board table and informed Diane and Richard that they were under arrest for forgery, fraud, and theft by deception. Diane screamed as they handcuffed her. Richard tried to invoke his credentials, but the deputies weren't interested. They led them out past neighbors who watched in silence. Not one person stood to defend them. Jenny Marsh was already calling in the story. I stood at the front, looking at the community that had finally seen the truth. It's not my story, I told her afterward. It's theirs. I just had the evidence to tell it. The trial concluded 8 months later in an Ashe County courtroom. Diane Prescott sat at the defense table in a gray blazer, her hair less perfectly styled than I remembered, her confidence visibly diminished. The evidence had been overwhelming forged deeds, death certificates proving impossible signatures, financial records showing systematic theft, and testimony from 3 families who'd lost everything to her schemes. Her attorney argued for leniency, citing her years of community service. The judge wasn't persuaded. Diane received 7 years 4 to be served in state prison. 3 suspended plus $850,000 in restitution and forfeiture of personal assets acquired through fraud. Richard received 5 years with 3 to serve, was permanently disbarred from practicing law in North Carolina, and ordered to pay $400,000 in restitution. Victoria Watson, the notary who'd certified signatures from dead people, received 2 years probation, had her notary license permanently revoked, and was fined $50,000 when the verdicts were read. Diane stared straight ahead, expressionless. Richard buried his face in his hands. The aftermath brought something I hadn't expected: restoration for the families who'd suffered longest. The Chavez property was returned to Olivia through a court-ordered title correction. Johnny Sanders received his father's land back, along with compensation for 18 years of lost use. The Nguyen's, who finally settled in California, joined a civil settlement that returned their property and provided damages. The HOA Reserve Fund was audited, frozen, and redistributed to homeowners who'd been paying dues into a system designed to rob them. Walter Grimes was elected interim president. New bylaws were drafted with term limits, mandatory financial audits, and supermajority requirements for any action affecting private property. The organization that had been weaponized against the community was rebuilt to serve it. I finished restoring the cabin the following spring. New roof with period-appropriate tin I'd sourced from a salvage yard in Virginia. Original windows repaired with wavy glass that matched what the Hendersons had installed a century ago. The porch was rebuilt using reclaimed chestnut I'd found in a demolished barn outside Boone. Inside, I'd discovered furniture in the attic: a rocking chair, a small table, a wooden chest, all Henderson pieces that had been forgotten for decades. I restored each one and placed them back where they belonged. In the front room, I created a small display photographs of Walter and Martha Henderson from the tin box, the original 1924 deed in a simple frame, and a brief history of the property I'd typed and mounted on the wall. This cabin had stood for 100 years. It deserved to be remembered. The community I'd had to fight to enter slowly became something else: neighbors, then friends. Olivia Chavez stopped by one afternoon with a pie her mother had baked, the first dessert the family had made since her grandmother's death. Johnny Sanders helped me install a new mailbox at the road, and we spent an hour afterward just talking on the porch. Walter became a regular visitor, sharing stories about Pinewood Ridge's real history, the families who'd built it, the changes he'd witnessed, the quiet dignity of mountain people who just wanted to be left alone. I thought about Elena often during those months. She would have loved this place: the light through the trees in the morning, the silence broken only by birdsong, the sense of belonging to something older than yourself. On a warm evening in late May, I sat on the restored porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sun drop behind the ridge. The cabin stood solid behind me, beautiful in a way that only comes from survival. I'd come here looking for a project to lose myself in. I'd found something more: a home worth fighting for, a community worth saving, and a truth that refused to stay buried. The mountains held the last of the light as darkness crept up from the valley, somewhere down the road. I heard Walter's truck pulling into his driveway. Tomorrow there would be more work, there always is, but tonight I just sat and breathed, finally at peace.